The sound of raindrops hitting the old wooden shutters filled the small apartment above Rosa's bakery in Barcelona. 17-year-old Elena had grown used to these sounds over the years. They told her stories that her eyes never could. Tonight, the rain was gentle, almost musical, and it mixed perfectly with the melody flowing from her fingertips. Elena sat at the old piano that had been her best friend since childhood. The instrument was far from perfect. Some keys stuck when pressed, others made strange clicking sounds, and the wood was scratched and faded from decades of use. Her grandfather had bought it from a closing music shop years ago, spending his last savings on what most people would call a broken-down piece of furniture. But to Elena, it was pure magic. Her fingers moved across the keys like they were dancing. She didn't need to see the black and white pattern that others relied on. Her hands knew every inch of this piano. They knew which key would stick if pressed too hard, which pedal squeaked when used, and exactly how much pressure was needed to make each note sing just right. The piece she was playing tonight was special. Chopin's Ballade No. 1 had been calling to her for weeks. She'd heard it on an old radio broadcast, and something about it made her heart race. The way it started so softly, almost like a whisper, then built into something powerful and dramatic. It reminded her of her own life in many ways. Elena had been born blind, but she never felt sorry for herself. Her grandmother Rosa had made sure of that. "Mia," Rosa would say, "God gave you something special. Your ears hear things others miss. Your heart feels music in ways they never will." And Rosa was right. When Elena played, something magical happened. People would stop talking, stop moving, stop everything just to listen. Tonight was different, though. Rosa was having one of her small gatherings downstairs. Once a month, she invited local music lovers to the bakery after closing time. They would drink coffee, eat pastries, and share their love for music. Sometimes someone would bring a guitar. Other times they would just listen to records on Rosa's old player. Elena usually stayed upstairs during these gatherings. She was shy around new people, especially adults who often didn't know how to talk. To her, they would either speak too loudly, as if being blind meant she was deaf, or they would avoid her completely, uncomfortable with her condition. But tonight, the music was calling to her stronger than usual. She couldn't help herself. Her fingers found the opening notes of the ballade as she let herself get lost in the melody. The apartment around her seemed to disappear. There was only her, the piano, and Chopin's beautiful, complicated emotions flowing through the keys. She was deep in the middle section when she made a small mistake. Her left hand stumbled slightly during a particularly difficult passage. It was the kind of error that most people wouldn't even notice, but Elena heard it clearly. She paused for just a moment, then continued playing, correcting the phrase as she went. What she didn't know was that someone new had arrived at Rosa's gathering. Ricardo Valdez was a name that appeared on concert posters across Europe. At 45, he had built a reputation as one of the finest classical pianists of his generation. He had performed in the world's most famous concert halls, had won international competitions, and had recorded albums that critics praised for their technical perfection. But Ricardo had another reputation, too. Those who worked with him knew he could be difficult. He had little patience for amateur musicians and often made cutting remarks about performances he considered below his standards. He believed that classical music was a serious art form that shouldn't be attempted by those without proper training and natural talent. Tonight, he was in Barcelona for a concert at the Palau de la Música Catalana. A mutual friend had invited him to Rosa's small gathering, describing it as a charming local tradition. Ricardo had agreed to stop by, more out of politeness than genuine interest. He had been downstairs for only a few minutes, making polite conversation, while privately judging the modest surroundings when he heard the piano music from upstairs. At first, he was impressed. Someone was attempting Chopin's ballade, No, which was no easy task. The opening was played with sensitivity and good technique, but then came the mistake. Ricardo's trained ear caught it immediately. His eyebrows raised slightly, and he tilted his head to listen more carefully. When he heard the correction that followed, his expression hardened. This was clearly an amateur trying to play a piece far beyond their skill level. "Whose piano is that?" he asked Rosa, interrupting her mid-sentence as she was telling a story about the bakery's history. "Oh, that's my granddaughter Elena," Rosa said with obvious pride. "She's been playing since she was tiny. That old piano belonged to her grandfather." Ricardo nodded politely, but inside he was already forming his opinion. Another untrained musician, butchering classical masterpieces. He had encountered this countless times. People who thought that feeling the music was enough, who believed that passion could replace proper technique and years of study. "She's blind, you know," Rosa continued, her voice soft with love. "But when she plays, it's like she can see things the rest of us can't." This information only made Ricardo more critical. He had known several blind musicians throughout his career, and while some had achieved remarkable success, he had also seen too many people use blindness as an excuse for technical shortcomings. The public, he believed, was often too quick to praise disabled performers out of sympathy rather than honest musical judgment. The music continued from upstairs, and Ricardo found himself listening despite his growing irritation. The performer, this Elena, was clearly familiar with the piece. She navigated most of the difficult passages competently, but there were small errors, moments where the interpretation seemed naive or overly sentimental. Would it be possible to meet this young pianist? Ricardo asked, his tone carefully neutral. Rosa's face lit up. Of course, she would be so honored. Let me call her down. But Ricardo was already moving toward the stairs. Actually, if you don't mind, I'd prefer to hear her finish the piece first. May I go up? Rosa nodded eagerly, clearly delighted at the prospect of her granddaughter meeting such a distinguished musician. She had no idea what was about to happen. She couldn't see the cold calculation in Ricardo's eyes, couldn't hear the dismissive tone hidden beneath his polite words. As Ricardo climbed the narrow wooden stairs, Elena continued playing, completely, unaware that her quiet evening was about to change forever. She was lost in the music, her heart poured into every note, her soul connected to Chopin's composition in a way that felt almost spiritual. The floorboards creaked under Ricardo's expensive leather shoes as he reached the top of the stairs. Elena's apartment was small and simple, with furniture that had seen better days and walls that needed fresh paint. But there was warmth here, love in every corner, and photographs of family covering every available surface. Elena sat at the piano with perfect posture, her face peaceful and concentrated. Her fingers moved with confidence across the worn keys, and Ricardo had to admit that her hand position was quite good. Someone had taught her well, at least in the basics. But as he listened to her play the final section of the ballade, Ricardo's critical nature took over. He heard every small imperfection, every moment where the tempo wasn't quite right, every phrase that could have been shaped more beautifully. In his world of concert halls and recording studios, these details mattered enormously. Elena played the final dramatic chords and let her hands rest on the keys, a small smile on her face. She had felt something special in that performance, something that made her heart sing. The rain had stopped outside, and the apartment was filled with a peaceful silence that felt almost sacred. Then she heard the footsteps, and everything changed. The silence that followed Elena's performance lasted only a few seconds, but to her, it felt like forever. She was still smiling, still feeling the warmth of the music in her chest, when a voice cut through the peaceful quiet like a knife through. "Silk, who on earth taught you to destroy Chopin like that?" Elena's hands jerked away from the piano keys, as if they had suddenly become burning hot. Her smile disappeared instantly, replaced by confusion and shock. She turned her head toward the voice, her unseeing eyes wide with surprise. The tone was cold, sharp, and completely unfamiliar. "I am sorry," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. The expensive leather shoes clicked against the wooden floor as Ricardo stepped fully into the room. He looked around the modest apartment with barely concealed disdain, taking in the faded wallpaper, the mismatched furniture, and the old family photographs scattered across every surface. His eyes settled on Elena, sitting at the worn piano in her simple cotton dress, her hands still trembling slightly from his harsh words. "You heard me correctly," Ricardo said, his voice carrying the authority of someone used to being obeyed. "That was not music. That was vandalism. You have taken one of the most beautiful pieces ever written and turned it into something painful to listen to." Elena felt heat rise in her cheeks. She had been playing piano for over 12 years, since she was 5 years old. Never in all that time had anyone spoken to her this way about her music. Sure, she knew she wasn't perfect. She knew she made mistakes. But the way this stranger was talking to her made her feel like she had committed some terrible crime. I was just practicing," she said, her voice getting smaller with each word. "I didn't know anyone was listening." Ricardo let out a short, bitter laugh that had no warmth in it whatsoever. "Practicing? Is that what you call it? My dear girl, practice is supposed to improve your playing, not make it worse. What I just heard was a complete massacre of one of classical music's greatest masterpieces." By now, the sounds of the confrontation had carried downstairs. Elena could hear footsteps on the stairs, hushed voices, and the creak of floorboards as people gathered at the bottom of the staircase. Her grandmother's voice rose above the others, sharp with concern. "Elena? Mia? Is everything all right up there?" But Ricardo wasn't finished. He moved closer to the piano, his presence somehow making the small room feel even smaller. Elena could smell his expensive cologne, could hear the rustle of his perfectly pressed suit. Everything about him spoke of wealth and sophistication, making her feel suddenly ashamed of her simple surroundings. "Tell me," Ricardo continued, his voice dripping with false curiosity, "how long have you been playing piano? And more importantly, who was the unfortunate teacher who allowed you to develop such terrible habits?" Elena's throat felt tight. She wanted to defend herself, to explain that she had taught herself most of what she knew, that her grandmother had paid for only a few lessons years ago before money became too tight, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she sat frozen, feeling smaller and more helpless with each passing second. I mostly teach myself," she finally managed to say. "Ah," Ricardo said, nodding as if this explained everything. "That explains the complete lack of proper technique." And the interpretation ... double quotes. He shook his head dramatically. "Chopin's ballade, no. One requires years of study to understand properly. It's not a piece for beginners to stumble through." The people downstairs were getting closer now. Elena could hear her grandmother's voice, worried and protective, asking someone what was happening. She could hear other voices too, people from the music gathering who had come to see what the commotion was about. Ricardo seemed to enjoy having a larger audience. His voice got louder, more theatrical, as if he were performing for a crowd. "This is exactly what's wrong with music today," he announced. "Everyone thinks they can just sit down at a piano and play whatever they want. They don't understand that classical music is an art form that requires dedication, proper training, and natural talent." Elena felt tears starting to form in her eyes. She blinked hard, trying to hold them back. She had learned long ago not to cry in front of strangers. People already saw her as different, as someone to be pitied because of her blindness. She couldn't let them see her cry, too. The technique alone, Ricardo continued, warming to his subject, was absolutely dreadful. Your hand position is inconsistent. Your pedaling is sloppy. And don't even get me started on your timing. But the worst part, the truly unforgivable part, is the way you've completely misunderstood what Chopin was trying to express. He gestured dramatically at the piano, as if it were evidence in a court case. This piece tells a story. It has deep emotional meaning that comes from understanding the composer's life, his struggles, his genius. You can't just play the notes and expect to capture that meaning. You've turned something beautiful into something trivial. Elena's grandmother appeared at the top of the stairs, her face flushed from climbing quickly. Behind her, several other people crowded together, their faces showing confusion and growing anger at what they were witnessing. What is going on here? Rosa demanded, her voice sharp with protective fury. Who are you, and why are you speaking to my granddaughter this way? Ricardo turned to face the small crowd, his expression one of mild annoyance at being interrupted. I am Ricardo Valdez, he said, as if his name should mean something to everyone present. I am a professional pianist, and I was simply trying to provide some honest feedback to your granddaughter about her playing. Honest feedback? Rosa's voice rose an octave. You call insulting a 17-year-old girl honest feedback? I call it necessary, Ricardo replied coldly. Too many young people these days receive false praise. It does them no favors. They develop unrealistic expectations about their abilities. It's kinder to be honest now than to let them continue believing they have talent when they clearly don't. The words hit Elena like physical blows. She had always known she wasn't as good as the pianists she heard on the radio, but music had been her joy, her escape, her way of expressing feelings she couldn't put into words. To hear someone dismiss not just her playing, but her very right to play felt like having something precious torn away from her. Furthermore, Ricardo continued, seemingly oblivious to the growing hostility in the room, playing classical music requires more than just pressing keys. It requires understanding, sophistication, and frankly, the ability to see the music you're playing. How can anyone properly interpret a piece when they can't even read the sheet music? The room fell completely silent. Elena felt as if all the air had been sucked out of her lungs. In all her years of being blind, she had faced ignorance, pity, and awkwardness from others. But never had anyone suggested that her blindness made her incapable of understanding music. Perhaps, Ricardo said, his voice now taking on a tone of false kindness, you should consider focusing on something more suitable. Simple folk songs, maybe. Children's melodies. Leave the real music to those who have the training and the capabilities to do it justice. Elena's hands, which had been clenched in her lap, slowly relaxed. Something was changing inside her. The hurt and embarrassment were still there, but they were being joined by something else. Something that started as a tiny spark of anger and was growing into something much stronger. She had spent her entire life proving that her blindness didn't limit her. She had learned to navigate the world through sound and touch, had developed abilities that amazed even her grandmother. She had poured her heart into music, had found joy and meaning in every note she played. And now this stranger, this man who didn't know her at all, was telling her that everything she had worked for, everything she loved, was worthless. Elena stood up slowly from the piano bench. Her legs felt shaky, but her resolve was growing stronger with each passing second. She turned toward Ricardo's voice, her chin lifting in a gesture that Rosa recognized immediately. It was the same look Elena had worn as a child when someone told her she couldn't do something because of her blindness. You're absolutely right about one thing, Elena said, her voice quiet but steady. I cannot see the sheet music. I cannot see the keys. I cannot see you or anyone else in this room." Ricardo's expression showed mild satisfaction, as if he had finally gotten through to her. But Elena wasn't finished. "However," she continued, her voice growing stronger, "there are some things that blindness has taught me to see that your eyes have apparently missed completely." The words hung in the air like electricity before a storm. Elena stood perfectly still, her back straight and her head held high, while everyone in the room waited to see what would happen next. Her grandmother Rosa watched with a mixture of pride and worry, recognizing the determined look on her granddaughter's face, but unsure where this confrontation was heading. Ricardo raised an eyebrow, clearly amused by what he saw as a teenager's attempt to sound profound. "Oh, really?" he said, with a condescending smile. "And what exactly has your blindness taught you to see that the rest of us have missed?" Elena took a deep breath, feeling the familiar calm that always came over her when she was about to face a challenge. It was the same feeling she had experienced as a child when other kids said she couldn't ride a bike, or when teachers suggested she might struggle in regular classes, or when strangers assumed she needed help with simple tasks. "It has taught me that music isn't something you look at," she said, her voice steady and clear. "Music is something you feel, something you become part of. When you can see, it's easy to get distracted by the technical details, by the complexity of the notation, by trying to impress others with your knowledge." She paused, turning her face slightly toward the window where she could hear the last drops of rain falling from the roof. "But when you can't see any of that, you have to go deeper. You have to listen not just to the notes, but to the spaces between them. You have to feel not just the melody, but the emotions that created it." Ricardo's smile faltered slightly, but he quickly recovered. "That's a very poetic way of looking at it," he said dismissively. "But poetry doesn't fix wrong notes or poor timing. It doesn't replace years of proper training and study." "You're absolutely right," Elena agreed, surprising everyone in the room. "Poetry can't fix technical mistakes." "But tell me something, Senator Valdez. When you play Chopin, what do you see?" The question caught Ricardo off guard. "What do I see?" "I see the music, of course. The notation, the structure, the harmonic progressions, exactly," Elena said with a small nod. "You see? The technical parts, the framework, the skeleton of the music. But do you see Chopin himself?" Ricardo frowned, not sure where she was going with this. "I don't understand what you mean." Elena moved away from the piano bench, walking slowly across the small room with the confidence of someone who knew every inch of the space. Her fingers trailed along the back of an old chair, then found the windowsill where she often sat to listen to the sounds of the street below. "Chopin wrote that ballade when he was homesick," she said quietly. "He was living in Paris, far from his beloved Poland, knowing he might never see his homeland again. The piece starts so gently because that's how memories begin, soft, almost hesitant, like you're not sure if you should let yourself remember." She turned back toward the room, her unseeing eyes somehow managing to convey deep emotion. "But then the memories get stronger. They pull you in deeper until you're not just remembering, you're reliving. That's why the middle section gets so passionate, so intense. It's not just notes on a page. It's a man's heart breaking for everything he's lost." The room had grown completely quiet. Even Ricardo found himself listening, despite his skepticism. There was something in Elena's voice, something in the way she spoke about the music, that made it impossible to ignore her words. "And then," Elena continued, "comes the part that most people play wrong. The ending. Most pianists play it like a grand finale, like a triumphant conclusion. But that's not what Chopin wrote. He wrote acceptance. Sad, beautiful acceptance that some things can never be recovered, but that the love for them will never die." She walked back toward the piano, her hand finding the warm wooden edge with practiced ease. When I play that piece, I don't see notes or timing or technical requirements. I see a young man standing at a window in Paris, looking out at a foreign sky and remembering the way the light looked different in Poland. I feel his longing, his sadness, his love for something he can never have again. Rosa wiped tears from her eyes, amazed as always by her granddaughter's insight. Several of the other people in the room were visibly moved, but Ricardo stood with his arms crossed, trying to maintain his skeptical expression. "That's a very touching interpretation," he said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier harshness. "But emotional understanding alone doesn't make a performance great. Technical skill matters. Precision matters. Years of training matter." "I never said they didn't," Elena replied calmly. "But technical skill without emotional truth is just showing off. It's like having perfect handwriting, but nothing important to say." She sat back down at the piano bench, her hands resting lightly on the keys. "You criticized my technique, my timing, my training, and you're probably right about all of those things. I know I make mistakes. I know I'm not perfect." Ricardo nodded, feeling vindicated. "Exactly. So perhaps you understand now why I—" "But," Elena interrupted gently, "I also know something that you seem to have forgotten. Music wasn't created to be perfect. It was created to be felt. Chopin didn't write that ballade to show off his technical skills. He wrote it because he had feelings too big for words, feelings that could only be expressed through music." She pressed a single key, letting the note ring out in the quiet room. "Every time I sit at this piano, I'm not trying to impress anyone. I'm not trying to prove how much I've studied or how perfectly I can execute a difficult passage. I'm trying to have a conversation with Chopin, with Beethoven, with Mozart. I'm trying to understand what they were feeling when they created these pieces." Ricardo found himself in unfamiliar territory. In his world of concert halls and critics, music was judged by measurable standards. Technical accuracy, perfect timing, flawless execution. These were the things that mattered. But this young woman was talking about music in a way that reminded him of something he had almost forgotten. "You speak as if music is alive," he said, his tone less harsh than before. "Isn't it?" Elena asked simply. "When Chopin wrote that ballade, he poured his life into it. His joy, his sorrow, his hopes, his regrets. That doesn't die just because he's gone. It lives on in the music, waiting for someone to find it again." She turned toward where Ricardo was standing, her expression serious but not confrontational. "You said I can't properly interpret a piece because I can't see the sheet music. But I think maybe seeing the sheet music sometimes makes it harder to see the heart of the music." "That's ridiculous," Ricardo said, but his protest sounded automatic, lacking the conviction of his earlier criticisms. "Is it?" Elena asked. "When you look at sheet music, what do you see first? The notes, the timing, the key signature, the technical challenges. Your eyes tell you what to think about the music before you even hear it. But when I approach a piece, I have to listen first. I have to feel my way into it, discover it note by note, emotion by emotion." She demonstrated by playing the opening phrase of the ballade, her touch gentle and exploratory. "I can't see that this passage is marked andante cantabile, but I can hear that it wants to be sung softly like a lullaby or a distant memory. I can't see the dynamic markings, but I can feel where the music wants to grow louder and where it wants to whisper." Ricardo watched her hands as she played, noticing things he had missed during his harsh critique. Her touch was indeed very gentle, and she seemed to coax sound from the old piano rather than forcing it. There was something almost conversational about the way she played, as if she were having an intimate discussion with the instrument. "I'm not saying my way is better," Elena continued, her hands still moving softly over the keys. "I'm just saying it's different. And maybe, just maybe, Both ways have something valuable to offer. She stopped playing and looked up toward Ricardo's voice. You asked who taught me to play. The truth is, Chopin taught me. Beethoven taught me. Every composer whose music I've ever fallen in love with has been my teacher. They've taught me that music is a language of the heart, and the heart doesn't need eyes to see. The room remained silent for a long moment. Ricardo felt something stirring inside him that he hadn't experienced in years, uncertainty. For so long, his understanding of music had been built on concrete, measurable things. But listening to this young woman speak about music with such passion and insight made him question whether he had been missing something important. So what are you proposing? He asked finally. Elena smiled for the first time since the confrontation began. I'm proposing that maybe we both have something to learn. You could teach me about technical precision, about the structure and theory that I've missed by teaching myself. And maybe I could remind you what it feels like to discover music with your heart instead of your eyes. She stood up from the piano bench again, her movement graceful and purposeful. But first, I'd like to ask you a question. You said, I destroyed Chopin's ballade. You said I turned something beautiful into something painful to listen to. Would you be willing to hear it again? Not to criticize this time, but to listen for what I was trying to say. Ricardo found himself genuinely curious for the first time since entering the room. And what exactly were you trying to say? Elena's smile grew wider, and in that moment, Rosa saw the fearless little girl who had refused to let blindness stop her from climbing trees or riding. The silence in the small apartment stretched on like a held breath. Elena's words about saying goodbye to fear and self-doubt hung in the air, and everyone present could feel that something important was about to happen. Rosa clutched her hands together, watching her granddaughter with a mixture of pride and worry. The other guests from downstairs stood frozen in the doorway, afraid to move or speak and break whatever spell was being cast. Ricardo found himself in completely unfamiliar territory. In his 30 years of professional music, no one had ever challenged him quite like this. Not with anger or defensiveness, but with quiet wisdom that made him question everything he thought he knew about music. This blind teenager had just turned his entire worldview upside down, with nothing but words and conviction. Very well, he said finally, his voice much softer than it had been all evening. I will listen, but understand that I have heard this piece performed by some of the world's greatest pianists. I have played it myself in concert halls across Europe. My standards are not ... flexible. Elena nodded, understanding perfectly what he was saying. She knew he wasn't just going to listen as a casual observer. He would be analyzing every note, every phrase, every subtle detail, in a way that made what she was about to do even more meaningful. She wasn't performing for someone who would be impressed by her blindness or moved by sympathy. She was performing for someone who truly understood music at the highest level. I understand, she said simply, and I wouldn't want it any other way. She moved back to the piano bench with the same graceful confidence she had shown throughout their conversation. Her hands found their position on the keys, but she didn't begin playing immediately. Instead, she closed her eyes and took several deep breaths, centering herself in the way her grandmother had taught her years ago. Before I begin, she said quietly, I want to tell you what I see when I play this piece. Not with my eyes, but with my heart. Elena's hands hovered over the keys as she spoke. I see a young man, barely older than I am now, sitting at a piano in a foreign country. He's homesick in a way that goes deeper than missing family or friends. He's missing the very essence of who he is, the land that made him, the culture that shaped his soul. Ricardo shifted slightly where he stood, surprised to find himself genuinely interested in her interpretation. The opening notes, Helena continued. They're hesitant, because he's not sure he should let himself remember. Memory can be dangerous when you're trying to build a new life in a new place. But the heart doesn't care about practical decisions. The heart remembers what it loves. Her fingers found the first chord, and immediately something magical happened. The sound that came from the old worn piano was somehow different than what anyone had heard before. It wasn't louder or technically more complex. It was simply more present, more alive. Elena played the opening phrase with a tenderness that made Rose's breath catch in her throat. Each note seemed to hang in the air for exactly the right amount of time, neither rushed nor dragged, but flowing like natural speech. The melody wasn't just being played. It was being spoken, in a language that everyone in the room understood, even if they couldn't explain how Doc Ricardo found himself leaning forward slightly, his critical defenses beginning to lower despite his intentions. He had heard this opening, performed hundreds of times, but never quite like this. There was something in Elena's touch that suggested she wasn't just playing notes she had memorized. She was discovering the music as she went, as if hearing it for the first time, while simultaneously understanding it completely. As the piece moved into its more complex middle sections, Elena's entire body became part of the performance. Her shoulders swayed gently with the rhythm, her head tilted as if she were listening to something only she could hear, and her face reflected every emotion the music contained. During the tender passages, her expression was soft and almost vulnerable. During the dramatic sections, her features showed intensity and passion that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside her soul. But it was more than just emotional expression. Elena's technical skills, which Ricardo had criticized so harshly, seemed to have transformed completely. Her fingers moved across the keys with precision and confidence, navigating even the most difficult passages with an ease that spoke of deep understanding rather than mere muscle memory. The timing that had seemed inconsistent during our earlier playing was now perfect, but not in a mechanical way. It was the kind of perfect timing that comes from feeling the natural pulse of the music itself. The guests who had gathered to watch found themselves forgetting to breathe. Mrs. Martinez, who owned the flower shop next door, wiped tears from her eyes without even realizing she was crying. Old Mr. Fernando, who had been skeptical of Elena's abilities for years, stood with his mouth slightly open, completely mesmerized. Even Rosa, who had heard her granddaughter play thousands of times, felt like she was experiencing something entirely new. Ricardo, meanwhile, was going through his own internal revolution. Everything he had believed about music, about performance, about what made one pianist better than another, was being challenged by what he was witnessing. Elena's technique was indeed flawed in some traditional ways. Her hand position wasn't always textbook perfect, and she occasionally took liberties with tempo that would make classical purists cringe. But the overall effect was so moving, so authentic, so deeply musical that these technical imperfections seemed completely irrelevant. As Elena moved into the piece's most challenging section, something extraordinary happened. The old piano, which everyone knew had sticky keys and uneven tone, seemed to transform under her touch. Every note rang out clear and true, as if the instrument itself was inspired by her performance. The melody lines sang out above the accompaniment with perfect clarity, and the harmonies beneath supported them like a gentle embrace. Ricardo realized he was witnessing something he had read about, but never truly believed in. The moment when technical skill and emotional truth combined to create something greater than the sum of their parts. Elena wasn't just playing Chopin's notes. She was channeling Chopin's spirit, becoming a conduit for the composer's deepest emotions to flow into the present moment. The music built to its dramatic climax, and Elena's playing became fierce and passionate, without ever becoming harsh or aggressive. Her left hand provided a foundation of power, while her right hand soared through the melody with incredible agility and expression. The apartment seemed too small to contain the intensity of what was happening, as if the walls themselves might burst from the emotional pressure building inside the room. And then, as suddenly as the storm had come, it passed. Elena guided the music back to gentleness, her touch becoming soft and reflective again. The final section of the ballade flowed from her fingers like a prayer, each note placed with such care and meaning that it seemed to glow in the air before. Fading away, when Elena played the final chord, she let her hands rest on the keys for a moment, her head bowed as if in meditation. The silence that followed was different from any silence that had come before. It wasn't empty or waiting. It was full, pregnant with meaning, sacred in a way that made everyone afraid to be the first to break it. Ricardo stood perfectly still, his eyes wide with shock and something approaching awe. In all his years of professional music, he had never heard anything like what he had just experienced. He had heard technically superior performances, certainly. He had heard pianists with better training, more education, more experience. But he had never heard anyone capture the essence of Chopin's music with such pure, unfiltered authenticity. Slowly, as if moving through water, Ricardo began to applaud. His hands came together in slow, deliberate claps that echoed through the small room like thunder. One by one, the others joined him, but Ricardo continued clapping long after everyone else had stopped, tears streaming down his face without shame or embarrassment. "Forgive me," he whispered, his voice broken with emotion. "I have spent my entire career thinking I understood music, but you ... you have just shown me what I've been missing." Elena looked up toward his voice, her own eyes bright with unshed tears. "What did you hear?" she asked softly. Ricardo struggled to find words. "I heard ... He paused, searching for the right way to express what he had experienced. "I heard the difference between playing music and becoming music. I heard what it sounds like when someone's soul speaks directly through their fingers. I heard ... truth." He moved closer to the piano, his expensive suit wrinkled now, and his perfectly styled hair disheveled from running his hands through it. "In 30 years of professional performance, I have never heard Chopin played with such ... such honesty, such love." Elena smiled through her tears. "That's all I ever wanted," she said simply. "Just to love the music and let it love me back." Ricardo knelt down beside the piano bench, no longer the arrogant critic who had entered the room an hour earlier. "Will you teach me?" he asked, his voice humble and sincere. "Will you teach me how to hear music the way you do?" Elena stared in the direction of Ricardo's voice, hardly able to believe what she had just heard. The famous pianist who had walked into her grandmother's apartment with such arrogance and cruelty was now kneeling beside her piano bench, asking her to be his teacher. The transformation was so complete, so unexpected, that for a moment she wondered if she was dreaming. "You want me to teach you?" she asked softly, her voice filled with genuine confusion. "But you're the famous one. You're the one who plays in concert halls and has recordings that people buy in stores. What could I possibly teach you?" Ricardo looked up at her, his eyes still wet with tears he wasn't ashamed to show. "You could teach me what I lost somewhere along the way," he said quietly. "You could teach me how to remember why I fell in love with music in the first place." He stood up slowly, his movements careful and deliberate, as if he were a different person than the man who had entered the room an hour earlier. "I started playing piano when I was 4 years old," he continued, his voice taking on a reflective tone. "My mother said I was gifted, that I had a special talent that needed to be developed. By the time I was 6, I was taking lessons with the most demanding teachers my parents could find." Elena listened intently, beginning to understand something about the man who had been so cruel to her. "They taught me technique," Ricardo went on. "Perfect hand position, precise timing, flawless execution. They taught me to analyze every piece of music, to understand its structure, to identify its harmonic progressions and theoretical foundations. By the time I was a teenager, I could play anything you put in front of me with technical perfection. He paused, looking around the small apartment with its worn furniture and faded wallpaper. But somewhere in all that training, all that focus on being perfect, I forgot how to feel the music. I forgot how to let it speak to me instead of just through. Rosa, who had been listening from near the doorway, stepped forward. "Would you like some coffee?" she asked gently. "I think we all need a moment to process what just happened here." Ricardo nodded gratefully, and Rosa disappeared downstairs to prepare coffee for everyone. The other guests began to follow her, giving Elena and Ricardo some privacy to continue their conversation. But before they left, each one stopped to tell Elena how much her performance had moved them. Mrs. Martinez squeezed Elena's hand and whispered, "Mia, that was the most beautiful thing I've ever heard." Old Mr. Fernando, who usually kept his emotions to himself, patted Elena's shoulder and said simply, "Thank you for reminding an old man what magic sounds like." When they were finally alone, Ricardo sat down in Rosa's favorite armchair, looking suddenly exhausted. "Can I tell you something?" he asked. Elena nodded, settling back onto the piano bench. "I haven't felt anything when I play music in over 10 years, Ricardo admitted. "I can execute any piece flawlessly. Critics praise my technical skills, audiences applaud my performances, and other musicians respect my abilities. But when I sit down at a piano, I feel nothing. It's like I'm a very sophisticated machine, programmed to press the right keys at the right times in the right ways." Elena felt a wave of sadness for this man who had been so cruel to her. "That must be terrible," she said sincerely, "to have such skill but no joy in using it." "It is," Ricardo agreed. "And tonight, listening to you play, I realized what I've been missing. You don't just play music, you live it. Every note that came from your fingers was alive with emotion, with meaning, with purpose. It was like watching someone speak their native language after years of hearing people struggle with phrases they'd memorized from a book." He leaned forward in his chair, his voice becoming more animated. "When you played that opening passage, I could actually see what you described. The young man sitting at his piano, homesick and lonely. When you reached the dramatic section, I felt his passion, his longing for everything he'd lost. And when you played the ending, I understood for the first time that it wasn't triumphant. It was acceptance, just as you said." Elena smiled, feeling a warmth spreading through her chest. "Music is supposed to tell stories," she said. "Every piece is like a book, but instead of words, it uses sounds and silences and rhythms to share emotions and experiences." "Exactly," Ricardo exclaimed. "But I've been so focused on reading the technical aspects perfectly that I forgot to pay attention to the story being told." Rosa returned with a tray of coffee and some of her homemade pastries. As they sipped the warm, rich coffee, Ricardo continued sharing his thoughts about Elena's performance. "There's something else," he said, setting down his cup. "I've been thinking about what you said earlier, about learning music from the composers themselves rather than from teachers. In all my years of formal training, no one ever encouraged me to have that kind of personal relationship with the music." Elena took a small bite of her grandmother's famous almond pastry before responding. "I had to learn that way because I didn't have access to traditional music education," she explained. "When I first heard Chopin on the radio, I couldn't run to a music store and buy the sheet music. I couldn't take formal lessons because we couldn't afford them. So I had to listen to recordings over and over again until I could feel my way into the music." She set down her coffee cup and turned toward the piano. "Want to know a secret? I've never seen a single piece of sheet music in my entire life. Everything I play, I learned by listening and feeling and experimenting until I found my way into the heart of each piece. Ricardo stared at her in amazement. You mean you learned that entire ballade just by listening to recordings? Not just recordings, Elena corrected. I learned it by living with it. I would listen to a small section over and over again until I understood not just what notes were being played, but why those particular notes were chosen. What emotion was Chopin trying to express with that specific combination of sounds? What was he feeling when he wrote those particular chords? She demonstrated by playing a short passage from the middle of the ballade. This section here, most people play it like it's showing off, like Chopin was trying to prove how clever he could be with complex harmonies. But if you listen deeper, you can hear that it's actually a conversation. It's like he's arguing with himself, trying to decide whether to let himself fully feel his homesickness or to push it away and focus on his new life in Paris. Ricardo listened with complete fascination. How do you know that's what he was feeling? Elena smiled. Because I felt the same thing. When I was younger, I used to dream about what it would be like to see. I would imagine colors and faces, and all the visual beauty that everyone else could experience. But eventually, I realized that longing for something I could never have was keeping me from appreciating all the incredible things I could experience, like music that speaks directly to the soul. She played a few more notes, her touch gentle and contemplative. That's what this section of the ballad is about. It's Chopin working through his own longing, his own process of accepting what he's lost while learning to love what he still has. Ricardo was quiet for a long moment, processing everything Elena had shared. Finally, he spoke. I want to learn from you, he said firmly. Not just about technique or interpretation, but about this whole different way of approaching music. Will you consider it? Elena looked surprised. But what could we do together? You live in a completely different world than I do. You have concert tours and recording contracts and all sorts of important commitments. Actually, Ricardo said slowly, I've been thinking about that. What if we could find a way to combine your natural gift for emotional connection with some of the technical knowledge I've accumulated over the years? What if we could create something new together? Before Elena could respond, they heard footsteps on the stairs again. Rosa appeared, but this time she wasn't alone. Behind her came Carlos, a young man with a camera who worked for the local newspaper. I'm sorry to interrupt, Rosa said, but Carlos was downstairs having coffee when he heard Elena playing. He asked if he could record just a little bit, maybe write a small story for the newspaper about our monthly music gatherings. Elena felt a flutter of nervousness. I don't know if that's a good idea, Abuela. I mean, I'm not really a performer. Actually, Ricardo interjected, I think it's a wonderful idea. What you shared tonight shouldn't be kept secret. People need to hear what you can do, need to understand what music can be when it comes from the heart. Carlos stepped forward respectfully. Senorita Elena, I only need a few minutes. Maybe? Just one short piece? The story I'm thinking of writing isn't really about the music itself. It's about how music brings people together, how it creates understanding between different generations and backgrounds. Elena looked toward her grandmother, then toward Ricardo, then back toward Carlos. What kind of story? A story about how a famous pianist learned something new from a local teenager, Carlos explained. A story about how talent can be found in the most unexpected places, and how sometimes the best teachers are the ones who never thought of themselves as teachers at all. Ricardo nodded enthusiastically. It could inspire other young musicians who don't have access to traditional training. It could show them that there are many different paths to musical excellence. Elena thought for a moment, then slowly nodded.